everyone. Welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast. You know, there are all sorts of eventualities that happen in the podcast production cycle that can result in changes of plan at the last minute. So sometimes there's just a slow period in terms of getting interviews scheduled with guests. That's something that's been happening the past few weeks, where I've been trying to schedule things and it hasn't been working out, or they've had to be delayed for various reasons, which is fine. Occasionally the mishaps are a little bit more last minute. So for instance, I was going to have a new interview out for you, and I recorded a 3-hour interview with a guest yesterday, which I was going to break up into multiple episodes. But then, as it turned out, the guest was not happy with his performance in the interview, and he emailed me to ask me not to publish it just because he just wasn't happy with the job that he did. And so I honored that request, and so that won't go out. But thankfully, I usually have a few things in my back pocket to put out when there's no new interview available at the moment. So today I'm going to be talking about something I've thought about for many years and have discussed a few times, at least come up briefly on the podcast before, which is the relationship between music and the emotions, which obviously, if you're familiar with some of the classical views on music and the moral life, like those of Plato or those that Plato seemed to have held or put in the mouths of some of his characters in his dialogues, the relationship between music and the emotions will obviously tell us something not only about music itself, but also about music's relationship to the moral and spiritual life. But most proximately, it's important to get this relationship right in order to understand the proper nature and purpose of music itself. So in this episode, I'm going to read you something I wrote all the way back in 2010. And it's on this relationship between music and the emotions. It's the most sort of in-depth investigation of the topic that I've done. It's a paper that, whether you agree or disagree with it, I think is still pretty thought-provoking. I'm not sure that I would be as dogmatic in the position that I take as I was back in 2010, but I still largely hold the view that I do, if not being absolutely hardcore, that music, strictly speaking, cannot be said to express emotions. I remain opposed to the idea that the essential purpose of music is the expression or imitation of emotions or passions. So the way that I explored this topic in this thing I wrote is to look at the views of two very interesting 19th century commentators on music, who, as far as I know, were not familiar with each other's work, but their ideas converge in an interesting way. And these two thinkers are Eduard Hanslick and Edmund Gurney. Hanslick was a Catholic. He was born in Bohemia and worked in Vienna. He was a very, very influential music critic. In fact, apparently one of the first really widely influential music critics. It's a fairly recent profession. And he's known for having taken part in what was called the War of the Romantics, the sort of the more conservative wing of Romantic era composers like Brahms and Schumann versus some more radical composers like Liszt and Wagner. And Eduard Hanslick sided with the conservative wing in terms of his musical values. Liszt and Wagner were about, of course, the expression of intense emotions, and Brahms and Schumann were more about just musical form. Not that they weren't at all about expressing emotions. I'm not saying that. So Hanslick was very conservative in his tastes, and for the time, what was perceived as conservative anyway. But some of his philosophy of music is quite radical, and yet I think it probably comes closer to the truth than even some of for example, the classical Greek philosophers' view on music. Hanslick's best known writing is his book, translated with various titles, On the Musically Beautiful or On the Beautiful in Music. And Edmund Gurney was an English psychologist, and he wrote on a number of different topics. But he did write one book on music called The Power of Sound, which I actually have not read in its entirety, but the relevant sections do have some pretty interesting theories as to the sort of physiological and psychological effects of music. So in what I'm about to read to you, I take a look at these two thinkers, evaluate their positions in contrast to some of the opposition, and at the very end, I connect things to God. And before I start this, let me remind you that this podcast and everything we do, all of our podcasts and everything else at CatholicCulture.org are entirely funded by reader and listener donations. So if you'd like to help us keep going, please do go to CatholicCulture.org/donate/audio. We pray for our donors and all of our listeners and users every day. All right, so I hope you find this interesting. The title of this paper originally was Similarities in the Musical Aesthetics of Eduard Hanslick and Edmund Gurney. Of the many astounding reversals and metamorphoses in the musical culture of the 19th century West, one of the most noteworthy is the ascent in music criticism of instrumental music as an autonomous art form. In the 18th century, instrumental music was generally considered the lowest form of music, empty and trivial because of its lack of verbal content. Following the Platonic view in which music by definition includes words, the great 18th century theorist Heinrich Christoph Koch called instrumental music nothing but the imitation of song. Those who wished to promote instrumental music did so by claiming that it was its own language which could convey the subtlest meanings. Others incorporated music into the theory of art as imitation by emphasizing the technique of tone painting. In the late 18th century, the ability of instrumental music to affect the emotions without being tied down to a specific meaning was seen by some as an advantage. Both the denigrators of instrumental music and many of its champions shared the underlying assumption that the content of music must be something other than itself. This remained true even as instrumental music gained more and more prestige in the 19th century, though Franz Liszt, for example, declared instrumental music to be the highest and purest form of music. He valued it primarily in terms of its ability to communicate feelings and impressions. Liszt wrote that music embodies feeling without forcing it to contend and combine with thought. In other words, music directly communicates our affections in their entirety, as opposed to, quote, confirming or describing them. The composer Hector Berlioz, who defined music as, quote, the art of moving intelligent human beings, endowed with special well-trained organs by means of combinations of sounds, unquote, claimed that music produced in him the most extraordinary effects, including, quote, spasmodic muscular contractions, a trembling of all the limbs, a total numbness of feet and hands, a partial paralysis of the optical and auditory nerves, unquote. Berlioz's apparent superpower, enabling him to listen to and compose music amid such cochlear dysfunction notwithstanding, his description serves to illustrate how deeply the effective power of music had taken hold in the critical imagination. Two writers of the latter half of the 19th century would advocate a soberer aesthetic. These were Eduard Hanslick, 1825 to 1904, a critic working in Vienna whose treatise On the Musically Beautiful was published in 1854, and Edmund Gurney, 1847 to 1888, an English psychologist whose The Power of Sound was published in 1880. Though Hanslick and Gurney do not seem to have been familiar with each other's writings, they reached similar conclusions regarding the limited role of the emotions in music and the relationship between musical form and content, and they offered a glimpse of what the true connection between music and extra-musical phenomena, including human emotions, might be. At the beginning of On the Musically Beautiful, Hanslick tersely lays out the two doctrines of the aesthetic of feeling, which he and Gurney will debunk. Hanslick says, of music in the first of these two roles, it is claimed that to arouse delicate feelings is the defining purpose of music. In the second, the feelings are designated as the content of music, that which musical art presents in its works. The two are similar in that both are false. In their respective treatises, Hanslick and Gurney limit discussion of expressivity in music to instrumental music. Hanslick expresses the reason for this well enough. He says, of what instrumental music cannot do, it ought never be said that music can do it, because only instrumental music is music purely and absolutely. Let me repeat that again, actually, because it's important. Of what instrumental music cannot do, it ought never be said that music can do it, because only instrumental music is music purely and absolutely. Hanslick argues compellingly that music does not have the power to represent any particular emotion. Emotions are inextricably linked to thoughts and ideas, which music cannot supply. Hope, for example, he says, cannot be separated from the representation of a future happy state, which we compare with the present. If we take this away, all that remains is an unspecific stirring, perhaps the awareness of a general state of well-being or distress." Unquote. Hanslick thus dismantles Liszt's idea that music represents specific feelings in a non-conceptual way, because, quote, Hanslick says, "The definiteness of feelings lies precisely in their conceptual essence." The definiteness of feelings lies precisely in their conceptual essence. Gurney, too, asserts that music is not essentially a representational art, but says that in addition to being impressive of its own intrinsic qualities, including whatever beauty it may possess, it can also be expressive of things outside itself. He describes expressivity in the following terms. "When we associate a quality of a piece of music with a feeling it seems to cause in us, then we say that the music is expressive of that feeling." Before entering into his central discussion of expressivity, he draws distinctions between his use of expressive in the text and other common uses. For example, we also use expressive as a figure of speech to mean that a piece of music moves us, usually without meaning that it expresses anything in particular. Likewise, the composer may be said to express himself in the sense that anything that is made bears the mark of its maker. The sense in which music is said to be expressive of something infinite or transcendental is also separate from Gurney's discussion of music as expressive. Gurney says, "There is a difference between music which is expressive in the sense of definitely suggesting or inspiring images, ideas, qualities, or feelings belonging to the region of the known outside music, and music which is not so expressive, and in reference to which terms of expression and significance, however intuitive and habitual, could only be logically pressed by taking them in a quite peculiar sense and postulating an unknown something behind phenomena which the phenomena are held to reveal or signify, or, according to Schopenhauer, objectify." Appealing in its flexibility, Gurney's aesthetics of music allows for a general kind of expressivity without fundamentally linking that expressivity to musical beauty. Nevertheless, the line he draws is nearly as hard as Hanslick's. Gurney says, "But the great point is that expressiveness of the literal and tangible sort is either absent or only slightly present in an immense amount of impressive music, that to suggest describable images, qualities, or feelings known in connection with other experiences, however frequent a characteristic of music, makes up no inseparable or essential part of its function, and that this is not a matter of opinion or of theory as to what should be, but of definite everyday fact." Gurney makes a strong case that music can be neither defined nor evaluated in terms of emotional expressivity. There's a great deal of oft-missed common sense in his statement that, quote, "A tune is no more constituted beautiful by an expression, e.g. of mournfulness or of capriciousness, than a face is." So we may say that a face is beautiful, but it's not beautiful because of any particular emotion if the face is beautiful in itself. Indeed, there is much beautiful music that suggests no particular emotion. Gurney says, "Clearly, if I find 20 bits of music beautiful and indescribable, and one bit beautiful and pathetic, it is unreasonable to say that I enjoy the last, which I don't enjoy at all more than the others, because it is pathetic." Gurney lists several more of his objections to the aesthetic of feeling. Musical characteristics which are typically associated with one emotion or another are powerless to move us if the work as a whole is not beautiful. On the other hand, two people may enjoy a good piece of music without responding to it in the same way emotionally. Furthermore, if the primary function of music is emotional expression, what is the point of having multiple pieces of music that seem to express the same feelings? How can one take seriously the claim that music expresses emotions with greater subtlety than do the physical movements of human beings when when its power to suggest emotions arises from musical motion's vague similarities to those very movements. This is a concept of Gurney's that will be explored further on. Finally, even if music were capable of such fine expression, Gurney calls it a dubious honor. Quote, "Those who imagine they dignify music by calling it a reflection of life forget that neither does life consist in pitching oneself without rhyme or reason from one definable mood into another, and would be very unpleasant if it did." Unquote. Having addressed expression, Hanslick attacks the more specific question of self-expression in music. Though a composer may be filled with emotion at the outset of his work, and though his emotion may even be that which initially prompts him to compose, Hanslick maintains that his emotion will never become part of the music because music is simply incapable of containing emotion. Hanslick says, "An inner singing, not a mere inner feeling, induces the musically gifted person to construct a musical artwork." Likewise, because a personal, subjective emotion is precisely personal and subjective, whatever emotion music may arouse in the listener cannot possibly be identical with the personal emotion of the composer. Like Hanslick, Gurney finds untenable the theory that allows the composer to express his emotions in music. Where Hanslick's objections are fairly abstract, so to speak, Gurney brings the reality of craftsmanship to bear on the issue. Composition is hard, often long-term work involving musical materials that have no intrinsic connection to emotions or events. A composer may feel a certain way when he sits down to write, but this has no necessary emotional consequence within the music. Quote, "The exciting music, which is held to indicate the pre-existence of some emotional storm in its author, may equally have been the result of the most peaceful and ordinary workday." Unquote. Even connections between a piece of music and the personality or life circumstances of a composer are typically imagined, says Gurney, by those who tend to make heroes of artists. Hanslick's treatment of the role of emotions in performance is somewhat confusing. He asserts that the performer of a work can communicate emotions into music because he is the direct physical cause of sounds coming into being in the moment. This is especially true, he says, in improvisation, as music is being simultaneously composed and performed. Hanslick describes the torrent of, quote, "love, jealousy, rapture, and grief," unquote, that breaks loose in improvisation. Yet he never attempts to reconcile this with his statement that it is simply not within the nature of music to represent emotions. If emotions can't exist without reference to thoughts and ideas, how can they be represented in music regardless of the phase of production in which we find it? We may be ruefully amused at Hanslick's example of jealousy, an influence from which few musical performances are spared, but a musical work cannot be jealous, nor are we jealous of the work but of the one performing it, and such jealousy may fester in us whether or not the performer himself is jealous. More bewildering, what has Hanslick meant by music up to this point, if not, well, music, of which it seems reasonable to assert that it does not exist unless it's being performed, whether on an instrument, in the aural imagination of a composer, or someone silently reading a score, or even in memory? Nevertheless, Hanslick goes on to say that in cases where music seems to have an especially intense emotional effect, psychological abnormality may be involved. He cites the example of Goethe, who recognized his own emotional reactions to music to be the result of, in Hanslick's words, nervous agitation. This certainly seems to apply to Berlioz's grotesque catalogue of symptoms, which also calls to mind Hanslick's sardonic treatment of those who love music only for its effects on their nervous systems. So here's Hanslick. "For people who want the kind of effortless suppression of awareness that they get from music, there is a wonderful recent discovery which far surpasses that art. We refer to ether and chloroform. Indeed, these drugs produce a supremely pleasant intoxication, the whole organism pulsating with sweet dreams, without our resorting to the vulgarity of wine-bibbing, which is in itself not without musical effect." In addition, Hanslick points out that mere sound, which is not music but makes up that art's material, can have powerful effects on the nerves whether or not it is heard in the form of music. These phenomena do not completely explain the emotional effects of music, but Hanslick's point is that this question lies outside the realm of aesthetics. Hanslick says, "The aesthetical recipe must show us how the musician produces beauty in music, not how he produces arbitrary effects in the audience." Nowhere, however, does Hanslick deny that music may cause us to experience feelings of one sort or another. Quote, I share completely the view that the ultimate worth of the beautiful is always based on the immediate manifestness of feeling. However, I hold just as firmly the conviction that from all the customary appeals to feeling, we can derive not a single musical law. His purpose rather is to demonstrate that the representation of emotions is not the essence of music. Quote, the rose is fragrant, but we do not say that its content is the representation of fragrance. To represent something always involves the notion of two separate, dissimilar things, of which one must be intentionally related to the other through a particular mental act. Gurney's observations that, quote, expression involves two things, one of which is expressed by the other, unquote, and that a thing does not express its own intrinsic qualities, that is, a tree does not express greenness, are strikingly similar to Hanslick's. Hanslick continues, admitting the emotional effects of music even as he disproves the aesthetics of feeling. Quote, joy and sorrow can in the highest degree be called into life by music. To this we entirely agree. But could not even more intense feeling be caused by winning a big prize in the lottery or by the mortal illness of a friend? So long as we are reluctant to include lottery tickets among the symphonies or medical reports among the overtures, we must not treat the feeling it in fact produces as an aesthetical specialty of music or of a particular composition. What then is the aesthetical specialty of music? For Hanslick, musical beauty is received neither in emotion nor in sensation, but in active imagination, in contemplation. Quote, out of the imagination of the composer, the piece of music arises for the imagination of the listener. Unquote. Music is hardly unique among the arts in its ability to move the emotions, nor does the same piece of music have the same effect on people in every age. Therefore, rather than defining music by its effects, we ought to examine the means by which they are achieved. Hanslick declares that the reason so many people have accused instrumental music of contentlessness is because they confuse content with an extra musical subject. He says, in music there is no content as opposed to form, because music has no form other than the content, which is nothing more or less, he says, than tonally moving forms. The content of music for Hanslick, tonally moving forms. And again, he says, the forms which construct themselves out of tones are not empty, but filled. They are not mere contours of a vacuum, but mind giving shape to itself from within. So for Hanslick, these forms reveal their beauty not to the feelings or even to the ear, but to what he calls the auditory imagination. Gurney defines what he calls musical subject matter, similarly to Hanslick's content. Gurney says the musical subject matter is auditory forms, i.e. series and combinations of sounds, wholly independent both of external phenomena and external utility, and having no existence independent of art. Meaning that sounds that occur in nature are not musical sounds. They have to be arranged, and there's always an artifice in music. So there is no musical subject matter independent of the art of music. Gurney's definition of musical form is practically the same thing. He defines musical form as abstract proportions of time and pitch. For Gurney, as for Hanslick, musical form and content are inseparable, if not identical, and both writers identify melody as the central form and content of music. Gurney calls it the prime and essential element. Hanslick gives it pride of place as the basic form of musical beauty, while rhythm, which includes the overall structure of a work, is the animating principle. These aesthetics demand that the listener contemplate music for its own sake, immersing himself in a world of tonally moving forms without indulging in his own thoughts or transports. Hanslick describes how, in the authentic musical experience, the secondary effects of music on the listener are swallowed up by the music itself. Quote, the more prominent the aesthetical moment in the hearer, just as in the artwork, the more inconspicuous it makes the merely elemental. That is, the listener who is focused on music rather than on his own feelings derives joy from a work with a sad subject so long as it's musically beautiful, but he takes no pleasure from even the most cheerful of unbeautiful songs. A truly musical person is distinguished not so much by what music he enjoys, as by the reasons he enjoys it. Quote, "The lay enthusiast likes to ask whether a piece of music is cheerful or sad, the musician whether it is good or bad. These pithy maxims clearly show which of the two parties is in the right." Having established that music's essence is not the representation of anything outside itself, Gurney and Hanslick both suggest that music has extremely general qualities also present in extra-musical reality, including the world of human emotions, which may shed some light on its effective power. The 19th century scientist Hermann Helmholtz had pointed out that musical motion resembles motion in space, and had suggested that without this resemblance, music would be unable to suggest emotions. Gurney admits to the parallel between melodic and physical motion, but contra Helmholtz denies that music's suggestion of the pleasure of muscular movement can ultimately explain either the pleasure music brings or the emotions it seems to suggest. The pleasure of muscular movement is of a different order from that of musical pleasure, and is associated with no specific emotions of the kind associated with music. Nor ought the similarities between musical and physical motion lead us to view musical motion as an idealization of physical motion. Gurney rather moves beyond muscular sensation to a discussion of how music may suggest force and pace. Quote, "And in the suggestion of movement, not confined to that experienced in our own bodies, although not connected with any distinctly imagined external events, we may readily allow music the benefit of associations, powerful though vague and remote, with those mightier rushes, stresses, and shocks of past experience, for the complete knowledge of which in the first instance vision was indispensable, since direct tactile and muscular experience of them would have been overwhelming to the body rather than to the mind." Though music does not embody or express definite emotions, it does have qualities which might relate to general aspects of non-musical existence. Gurney refers to, quote, "evenness and continuity or interruptedness and variability of musical movement," unquote, as traits that may faintly suggest natural activity and human feeling. Hanslick echoes this observation in less detail, saying that music can represent ideas related to its own specific audible qualities in categories he lists as strength, motion, and proportion. That is, music cannot represent feelings, but it can produce, suggest, or embody a dynamic or motion which makes up a small part of the experience of feeling. The concept that art shares general traits and processes with other phenomena has been hinted at by writers both before and after Gurney and Hanslick. Schopenhauer had already written that music is an expression of the will, the innermost being of the world, just as nature is, and therefore music does not represent nature but runs parallel to it. In the late 18th century, Carl Philipp Moritz had argued that the value of a work of art is complete in itself, contemplation of art being a way for us to enter into another world through the object, rather than merely incorporating the object into our world. According to this metaphysics of art, artistic beauty helps us to transcend our individuality and enter into something greater than ourselves. Hanslick did not discuss at length the transcendent significance of music, but the musicologist Karl Dahlhaus has provided us with a revealing excerpt from the first edition of On the Musically Beautiful, a passage omitted in later publications. So in that first edition, Hanslick had written, "The listener does not experience music merely as bare and absolute through its own beauty, but simultaneously as a sounding image of the great movements in the universe. Through deep and secret relationships to nature, the meaning of tones is heightened far beyond the tones themselves, and allows us always to feel the infinite, even as we listen to the work of human talent. Just as the elements of music, sound, tone, rhythm, strength, weakness, are found in the entire universe, so man rediscovers in music the entire universe." Karl Moritz had believed something similar, that a work of art, insofar as it possesses its own internal perfection, is a microcosm of the perfect universe. In his book Creative Intuition in Art and Poetry, the 20th century philosopher Jacques Maritain would later write something similar in regard to painting. Quote, "The painter does not look at nature as a separate thing in itself, to be copied or imitated in its external appearances. He looks at nature as at a creative mystery, which he tries to imitate in its secret workings and inner ways of operation." Unquote. Maritain traces this idea as far back as the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas. Doubtless it could be traced back further. If the life of music resembles that of the emotions, or that of physics, or that of human life, or of the entire universe, it is not because one imitates the other, but because each reflects, according to its nature, the inner life of a still greater source. All right, if you've listened this far, thank you very much for listening. I hope you got something out of it. Like I said, I don't know if I'd be quite as dogmatic today as I was back then, that music does not express emotion in any intrinsic sense, but I'm definitely certain that that's not the main value of music. And I think the reason that music tends to engender emotions in us other than psychological associations is something like what's described by people like Hanslick and Gurney. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to email me at podcast@catholicculture.org or just drop a comment on the YouTube video. And thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time.
Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Mike Aquilina, Catholic Culture Audiobooks, bringing to life classic Catholic works through professional, high-quality audiobook recordings, and Criterion, the Catholic Film Podcast, featuring deep analysis of great films from a Catholic perspective. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at catholicculture.org.